Are you guys ready to learn all about recessions? None of the bullshit you hear online about all the analysts throwing around things about recessions. Oh, the recession's coming and everything. No. Today we're taking a full and actual look at data and charts in order to determine if we're actually approaching a recession. I'm going to introduce 5 different indicators that are probably the best indicators to look at when we're determining if there's a recession coming. And we're going to use these and put them to work to actually determine if a recession is on the horizon, and if not, why this is the case and which indicators are causing it not to be seen as such. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Really informative one this week. Something you can actually use yourself to gauge if a recession is coming. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Buckle in because it's a good one, and I'll see you all next time. Let's talk about how we can recognize a recession. Let's get started, guys. So this is a video on how to be prepared and how to recognize a recession when it's forming or when it first starts. So the idea of a recession, and probably one of the most debated topics in the world right now, is whether a recession is coming, it's currently underway, or that we've already recovered from one. The goal of this video is to provide a clear guide in order to understand how to spot a potential recession, either one that's happening now or one that might happen in the future. So what we're going to look at first here is the obvious. Gross domestic product, also known as GDP, is our first contender. So let's start with the definition from economics. A recession is classified as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. When we use this definition, we actually entered a recession as of Q3 2022. But when we look back at the data at the end of the year, we saw that the third quarter had a positive 3.2% annualized growth in GDP. The fourth quarter had 2.6% growth, and the full year 2022 had a 2.1% GDP growth. So this doesn't really look like a recession anymore, does it? So we can look at this graph here. It kind of gives a nice depiction. We can see 2022 in total, which gave that 2.1% increase, and we have those 2 negative quarters in 2020 and 2022. The first and most obvious measure for determining whether or not a recession is occurring is to look at real GDP figures. This means adjusted for inflation. According to the chart we've seen above here, we entered a recession in both Q3 2020 and also Q3 2022, as we've discussed. But as we've determined, GDP doesn't tell the whole story, so let's keep digging. The next contender is the yield curve. Another classic recession as well as expansion indicator is called the yield curve. It represents the difference between the yield of short-term, which is typically the 2-year treasury bond, and the long-term, or typically the 10-year treasury bond, although these can vary in practice. During expansion periods, investors become relatively optimistic about the economy, meaning we receive a higher yield for holding for longer periods of time. This creates a positively sloped yield curve. So let's see how that looks here. So we have yield on the y-axis and the bond term in years on the x-axis. And we can see that the slope is positive because we get a higher yield in good economies on longer term bonds. Alternatively, it's often a good recession indicator as well when the yield curve on the yield on the 2-year bond is greater than that of the 10-year bond. And that looks like this. So we have that same chart here with the bond term and yield, but instead of a positive slope, it now has a negative slope as the short-term bonds have a higher yield. To explain why the yield curve inverts like this, we could explain it as good investments elsewhere becoming rare in a pre-recession environment. What this means is that it leads investors to move capital into long-term bonds as a safety net. This in turn increases bond prices and inversely reduces the yield, as is common for bonds. The inversion of the yield curve is commonly used as a recession indicator. A more recent issue with this measure relates to the rapid increase and decrease in interest rates, which has been happening more recently. The yield curve becomes a less accurate indicator due to rates on bonds being further altered by the Fed and, of course, Papa Powell. Regardless, the yield curve has successfully predicted the last 5 recessions, which makes us a little bit less skeptical about using it. So we can look at this information from Fred, this chart here, and I've circled the last 5 recessions here, and you can see that it went negative in all 5 cases, right before a recession. And those gray areas are recessions. So now let's take a look at the unemployment rate, which is our next indicator. When we take a look at the civilian unemployment rate, there is not a significant amount of lead time of increased unemployment prior to a recession. Take a look at this in a moment. However, recessions almost always involve layoffs, which acts as a lagged indicator for a recession, since unemployment rates increase during recessions more typically. The unemployment rate captures all individuals who are not working but are actively currently looking for work. They might also be working part-time and fall into this category. Only those who have become discouraged and quit, so-called discouraged workers, exited the labor force, and those who have retired are omitted from the measure. Recessions are notorious for high unemployment rates, although typically the employment rate is unusually low right before a recession, which in itself is not an indication of a recession. Taking a look at the Fred chart here, we can see again those spikes in unemployment rates in every single of the last 7 recessions. Next, let's take a look at another indicator, which is the federal funds rate, which, as we might know by now, is a large indicator of potential recessions. So as soon as the Fed starts decreasing rates, a recession is often not far behind. As of March 2023, the Fed has not yet implemented the reduction of rates and has more recently increased it still by 25 basis points. A falling Fed funds rate may be seen as the cause rather than the effect of a recession, but this is pretty misleading. Typically, the raising of rates causes the economy to slow into a recession, and the Fed reduces rates in a response to this. Higher rates increase the cost of debt, which increases saving and reduces spending, which leads to stifled economic growth as people put more of their money away and spend less. Therefore, when a recession ensues, interest rates fall quickly, which are reduced by the Fed in response to the recession in order to bring the economy back to its equilibrium. Here's a quick diagram from the Economic Policy Institute showing the effect of raising and decreasing rates on GDP growth. And GDP growth is a direct measure of economic activity and growth as well. So here's that chart here. And we can see when rates are the highest, it's followed by the sharpest declines in GDP decreases. Now, a very unusual indicator that we're going to look at here is heavy-weighted truck sales. The sale of heavy-duty trucks, which are typically used for mass goods production and industrial operations, is a surprisingly good recession indicator. When there is less demand for goods due to a depressed economy, people saving more and less consumption, Sales of heavyweight trucks declines, in part due to the expectation that economic growth will not continue, and therefore replacing older trucks or adding new ones to the fleet is not appealing. So essentially this means that the fleet of trucks is not going to increase in times where demand is not as strong. As a result, the past 7 recessions have seen significant reductions in the sales of heavy trucks, front-running the actual occurrence of recessions. This indicator, although unusual, may be a good one to keep an eye on. So let's take a look at the chart. So you can see in almost all of the recessions here, we have a front run of decrease in sales quite a bit before the actual recession. And this is something we're looking at as an indication of when a recession might occur. So now we've all been waiting for, are we actually headed for a recession? Using what we've learned about these indicators, let's see where we stand. First and most important, the yield curve has been negative since July 2022, and this is a very important aspect. Historically, looking at the charts, it's taken about 1 to 2 years for a recession to follow an inverted yield curve. Regardless, the yield curve is pointing to a possible recession in the near future, which is definitely something to note. We haven't officially entered a recession yet, and as a result, the unemployment rate doesn't provide us with much useful information since it is slightly lagged. In terms of heavyweight truck sales, they haven't declined since the 2020 recession, indicating that demand for goods is doing well and the goods economy as a whole is chugging along for now. In terms of the federal funds rate, although it hasn't started falling yet to response to a recession, rates have been steadily increasing the past year or so. This might be the strongest indication that we are being pushed into recession territory, since historically this has been a very strong indicator and cause for the fall in interest rates and therefore pushing us into a recession. Overall, the verdict is leaning more towards the possibility of us actually being in a recession fairly soon. Although early, the idea that the recession might ensue later in 2023 or early 2024 is a very real possibility. If we keep an eye on the indicators we covered here, we can much more easily pinpoint when a recession is likely to take place in the future and what causes them in the first place.